Friends, today I would like to share with you an amazing interview that was a real revelation. A former colonel in Swiss foreign intelligence has revealed the uncomfortable truth about Russia, the current conflict in Eastern Europe, and the West's strategic goals. More than 2 years after the start of this crisis, he bluntly explained exactly what the West wanted to achieve in relation to Russia and why these attempts failed. This interview, in my opinion, can be called sensational. The representative of the West, in fact, revealed all the cards, showing what the countries of the Western Bloc were trying to achieve and why their plan turned out to be a failure. Get ready to enjoy this interview with the revelations of the Swiss intelligence officer. Friends, let's not delay. Let's get started. Before moving on to the most striking part of the interview, I'll say a few words. When you hear the intelligence officer's words, you will understand the situation in which Russia and Putin found themselves in the year 2022. Let's start with the main thing. Despite the enormous pressure, Russia resisted, and its economy not only did not collapse, but also demonstrated resilience that few expected. The colonel explains that the collective West, using its global influence machine in trade, sanctions, and politics, hoped to deal Russia a serious blow that could undermine its economy and shake Vladimir Putin's power. However, this strategy was based on incorrect assumptions about the Russian mentality and system. The West believed that the 16,000 sanctions imposed against Russia, coupled with isolation in the international arena, would cause the collapse of the economy and the discontent of the population. But what do we actually see? The Russian economy not only did not collapse, but also rose to 5th place in the world in terms of GDP, overtaking Germany, once the leader of Europe's industry and economy. This came as an unpleasant surprise to Western analysts. It turned out that Russia, being isolated from many traditional markets, managed to reorient its trade flows, strengthen its domestic industry, and develop its own production. Contrary to the expectations of the West, Russian society has not succumbed to internal division, but, on the contrary, united around its leaders. The colonel emphasizes that the West underestimated Russia's historical resilience and its ability to cope with difficulties. He recalls that Russia has gone through the most severe crises: the 90s, the 1998 default, the Chechen conflicts, and prolonged counterterrorism operations in the Caucasus. Despite this, the country was able to recover, strengthen its institutions of power, and increase its internal resources. This hardened Russian society and the political system, which allowed them to withstand the most powerful pressure from more than 50 countries of the Western world. Just think, friends, on the one hand, there is Russia with its limited capabilities compared to the collective West. On the other hand, there are more than 50 countries with huge economic and technological potential. Nevertheless, Russia was able to resist this pressure, maintaining control over the internal situation and continuing to exert influence in the international arena. The colonel calls this a phenomenon that the West could not calculate. The former intelligence officer also notes that the West expected that pressure on the Russian economy would cause mass discontent among the population, which, in turn, was supposed to undermine Putin's position. However, Russia has a strong centralized system of government, and, as practice shows, society is ready to support the leadership in the face of external pressure. And here's the highlight of the interview as promised. Now, friends, listen to what this scout is saying. Quote: the sanctions did damage Russia, but not to the extent that we expected. Within a few weeks, Russia was able to overcome these problems. In fact, despite the difficulties in industrial production, Russia is far from being just a gas station, as John McCain claimed. That's not so. Russia is one of the leading manufacturers of nuclear power plants and has huge achievements in the field of high technology. For example, hypersonic missiles, which the United States cannot yet create. Russia has had such technologies for about 10 years. This was relevant even during the Cold War. We continue to underestimate Russia's technology capabilities. In addition, Russia supplies resources such as gas and oil to the West at low prices. If sanctions are imposed against these resources, it will shrink the market and prices for them will rise, which is a natural process based on the principles of supply and demand. When the supply decreases, the price increases accordingly. We are facing this today. Attempts to withdraw Russia from the oil and gas markets have led to an increase in inflation in our countries. Interestingly, the Europeans went further than the Americans. In the 21st year, when discussions began on sanctions against Russia, U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen tried to dissuade the Europeans from imposing sanctions on energy resources, saying that this would completely destroy the market. However, the Europeans did not heed these warnings, as they were susceptible to ideological influence. This is also an important aspect of this conflict. We see that the conflict is largely based not on facts, but on ideology and hopes. We can say that the West hopes that Russia will collapse, that it will lose. This is not based on real facts, but only on preconceived ideas, suspicions, and expectations. There is no real decision based on facts, and this, in my opinion, is extremely disturbing for observers like me. It is also worth noting an interesting point related to the idea of sanctions. In March of the 22nd year, an interview was conducted with the French Minister of Industry, who said that the goal was to make Russia collapse. To do this, they want to create difficulties for the Russian population. The idea was to deprive Russians of everything they love, such as McDonald's or Starbucks, with the expectation that people would start speaking out against the government because of dissatisfaction with the regime. However, this assumption turned out to be erroneous. Russians are an extremely patriotic people. This was true even during the Cold War. Most Russians hated the communist regime, but they loved their country. It was often difficult for them to separate their rejection of power and their sense of attachment to their homeland. Patriotism in Russia is extremely strong, which is completely different from the situation in the West. Friends, let's stop there for now before moving on to other interesting points from the interview with the Swiss intelligence officer. It is noteworthy that after so many years, the West still does not understand what Russia is and who Russians are. History knows many examples. Campaigns to the east, after which Western leaders admitted in their memoirs that they underestimated Russia and mistakenly imagined Russians. The level of foreign policy planning in Europe and overseas would seem to be high, but someone really thought that the departure of McDonald's or Starbucks would undermine the Russian people and lead them to protests against the government. In fact, Russia reacted to this with humor. All the assets of these companies were bought out by Russian entrepreneurs, and now they operate under local brands, paying high taxes to the budget. The quality of the products has not deteriorated, and sometimes even got better. This is another confirmation that there are practically no real experts on Russia in the West, or they simply do not listen to them. Another point is also interesting. The plan was to disrupt and destroy the Russian economy and isolate the country on the world stage. But the result was the opposite. Instead of isolating itself, Russia has strengthened its relations with the countries of the global South. BRICS, which was considered a marginal organization 10 years ago, has now surpassed the G7 in terms of total GDP. Moreover, the queue for joining the BRICS is growing. The West has only succeeded in making Russia a locomotive for promoting alternative international financial institutions that can replace the unfair sanctions policy. Instead of destruction, Russia has shown the whole world that sanctions can be overcome even against a nuclear power, and relations with other countries have only strengthened. The creation of a new system in which there would be no threats and multipolarity would become the basis. This is exactly the process that Western countries have launched by their actions. For example, Russia and India are actively working to create their own insurance and transportation companies, which allows them to transport huge volumes of oil without hindrance. Thus, despite the West's plans to leave Russia isolated, Vladimir Putin managed to do the almost impossible: to draw the attention of the entire global South to Russia as a country initiating the process of decolonization in a new format. Later in the interview, the Swiss intelligence officer answers a journalist's question about how the conflict affects international relations. On the one hand, we see the Western Bloc, and on the other, Russia, along with countries such as China, Iran, Turkey, and the BRICS countries. Quote from the Scout: "This is a very interesting question. The entire strategy developed before and at the beginning of the conflict was aimed at isolating Russia in order to cause its collapse. It was assumed that no one would buy from Russia and sell to it, which would lead to its collapse. That was the basic idea. However, the West's problem is that it often imposes sanctions on everyone. When you impose sanctions on countries like Iran or China, several questions arise. Firstly, these countries see no reason to support those who have imposed sanctions against them. Secondly, they are already under sanctions, so the logic is simple. It is better to preserve existing allies or establish new relations than to cooperate with those who isolate them. Iran is obviously not interested in supporting Western sanctions. China, for example, announced this very quickly. If he supports the West 100%, he will be next in line for sanctions. Why would he do that? We have seen that over the past year, NATO has begun to act against China. But why is the North Atlantic Alliance suddenly interested in the South China Sea? There's no logic to it. Therefore, China realizes that it has no incentive to follow the West. Thus, with its sanctions against Russia, the West has only contributed to strengthening ties between the countries under sanctions and creating a new global infrastructure based on multipolarity. The second key thought is that supporting a certain side in a conflict has a price. The example of Germany shows that energy resources are becoming more expensive, which affects the entire industry and the economy as a whole. Perhaps Western countries can afford such a price, but poor countries, such as in Africa, cannot afford it. They ask themselves, why should they participate in a conflict that is far from their interests and for which they will have to pay? The West is threatening sanctions if they do not join its position. However, many countries consider this unfair and wonder, where are their national interests? That is why more and more countries are beginning to doubt this world order. They see that the West has applied sanctions against Russia, including the freezing of public and private assets. This raises concerns. If sanctions can be applied to a nuclear power, what will they do to a small country? For many states, it is becoming preferable to refocus on cooperation with those who do not use sanctions as a policy tool. This leads to the creation of new economic and political ties. The Swiss intelligence officer makes an important observation. The conflict in Eastern Europe is not just a regional conflict. This is a struggle for global dominance, where either the West retains its influence or Russia establishes a new model of the world. The Russians have succeeded in disrupting the West's plans to isolate their economy. It is indeed a difficult task to stand up to the collective West, which unites dozens of countries, and enlist the support of the global South. However, Russia is successfully coping with this task. BRICS, which has become a symbol of alternative international structures, attracts more and more countries. This is Russia's success, which demonstrates that the world can be multipolar. Many countries sympathize with Russia, tired of the unfairness of the sanctions policy. They want to trade peacefully, develop their economies, and improve the lives of their populations. In this situation, Russia has become a kind of unifying center, similar to the role of the Kingdom of Sardinia, which once united Italy. This chess game continues, and Russia, despite serious challenges, holds its ground. More and more countries are expressing a desire to join a new world order based on justice and cooperation. Now I would like to summarize the material and express my thoughts. I believe that the Swiss intelligence officer has made an important and bold revelation that reveals the real picture of what is happening on the world stage. He not only openly announced the West's plans to isolate Russia, but also revealed the mechanisms behind these plans on a grand scale. This was not just a desire to weaken Russia, but a deliberate attempt to destroy its economy, deprive it of support on the global stage, and actually put the country in the position of a complete outsider. Thanks to his words, it became clear that a whole range of measures was directed against Russia, which perhaps not even everyone in the West fully realized. Previously, we could only guess at the real goals and plans of the West, but now everything has fallen into place. By bravely revealing the truth, the intelligence officer revealed the abscess of Western politics, which, in my opinion, could not but have its consequences. We see that the West, instead of working to create a fair multipolar system, was guided by an old, outdated approach to relations with Russia. It was not just pressure, but an attempt to influence Russia's internal affairs through sanctions, which eventually exacerbated the problem rather than solved it. And now that this has been discussed publicly, it has become obvious that such a policy simply cannot be successful in the long run. Thank you for your attention. Dear friends, be sure to write your opinion in the comments. I read all the comments and sometimes even reply to them. See you.